He came home earlier, hoping to find his wife there, but what he saw changed his life forever. Her innocent appearance and unmotivated lack of remorse couldn't hide the truth. She had betrayed him. And now, he was ready for revenge. Not for pain, but for her shattered control. He would no longer be the one who could be deceived. And it would all begin with one merciless step. You can't miss what happened next. Joe sat in his car, gripping his phone tightly. His heart pounded so loudly that even the engine couldn't drown it out. The chat with his wife was open on the screen. "Where are you?" He typed. "Read." But no reply. He shifted his gaze to the restaurant across the street. The windows glowed dimly, silhouettes of people moving inside. And among them, he saw her, Melissa. She sat at a table, smiling at someone, leaning forward in an engaged posture. Joe focused on the figure across from her. A man. His hand briefly touched her wrist. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, she leaned in even closer. Something inside him snapped. Just yesterday, they had dinner together. The kids were making noise in the kitchen, and she had been completely different. Cold, distant. She answered briefly, scrolling through her phone all evening. But now she was laughing. Alive. And he wasn't the one beside her. Joe clenched his jaw. He could storm inside and confront the man. But no, that would be too easy. He wasn't going to act on emotions. He would wait. "You're late again?" Joe asked calmly when Melissa walked into the bedroom. She didn't even flinch. Casually placing her purse down, she stretched as if it weren't past midnight. "Business meeting," she replied. "At a restaurant?" She hesitated, but only for a second. Just enough for him to notice. "Yes," she shot him a brief glance. "I have a new partner. We're discussing a project." "And why am I only hearing about this now?" Melissa sighed, as if he was once again failing to understand something. "Joe, I'm a blogger. My business is expanding. I have to meet people, build connections." And that's why you didn't answer my messages?" "I was busy." "But you weren't too busy to laugh with him at the table, were you?" Her face changed for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, then the mask of calm returned. "Were you spying on me? I saw you by accident." "This is ridiculous, Joe. I'm working. Do you even realize how much effort I put into securing a future for us and the kids?" "Oh, and I don't provide?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Melissa stayed silent. Joe looked at her, feeling anger mixed with something bitter. This wasn't the woman he had built a life with. "I'm going to bed," she finally said and quickly disappeared into the bathroom. The next few days were strange. Melissa remained distant, but she no longer tried to hide it. She spent more time in another room, working on her content. She was on her phone more often. One day, Joe approached her while she was editing a video. "What are you working on?" "Content for a brand." "What brand?" "Cosmetics." He looked at the screen. In the video, she was smiling, her voice warm. "Can you be like that at home, too?" She turned her head. "What? That cheerful?" "I'm working, Joe." "So what?" "I have a job too, but I don't act like my family is an inconvenience." "Don't you dare say that." "Then tell me honestly what's going on." She sighed, rubbing her face with her palm. "I'm tired, Joe. I'm just tired." "Of me?" Melissa said nothing. Joe started noticing the details. Melissa used to always answer his calls. Now she often ignored them. She stopped initiating intimacy. Her phone had a password now, something it never had before. One day, he saw a message when she placed her phone screen up. "I'm already waiting for you, winky face." Sender name. Business meeting. Joe barely had time to reach for the phone before Melissa quickly grabbed it. "What? Who is that?" "That's none of your business." He took a deep breath. "This isn't business, is it?" Melissa pressed her lips together. Joe felt everything tighten inside him. The next morning, he got up earlier. Melissa was still asleep. Joe took her phone while she wasn't looking. He found the chat. The same man. He started reading. His heart clenched. His blood ran cold. But when he reached the last message, he realized this was only the beginning. Joe stared at the last text. "I can't wait for you to tell him the truth. I want you to be only with me." His fingers tightened around the phone. The air in the room became heavy. His heart pounded, like someone was beating a drum inside his chest. He slowly turned his gaze to Melissa. She was sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She looked calm, carefree, and meanwhile, some other man was waiting for her to tell the truth. The truth about what? Their affair? That she was planning to leave him? Joe slowly placed the phone back and walked out of the room. One thought kept circling in his head. If she hadn't said anything yet, that meant he still had time. He didn't let anything show. He played his role, the loving husband who suspected nothing. Melissa acted as usual. She woke up, made coffee, sat down to edit her videos. But Joe saw her differently now. He walked up and kissed the top of her head. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," she said without looking up from the screen. "I was thinking, let's go somewhere this weekend. Just the two of us." She froze. "Why?" "Because we barely spend any time together." Melissa finally lifted her eyes to him. There was something wary in them. "I can't. I have an important collaboration." "With business meeting?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing. Just asking." He saw her tense up. He was on the right track. That evening, he watched her. She came out of the bathroom, drying her hair with a towel, and immediately picked up her phone, checked something, quickly typed a reply. Joe waited, and he wasn't wrong. 5 minutes later, she announced, "I need to go out." "Where?" "To a friend's." "Which friend?" Melissa bit her lip. "Amber." Joe nodded as if he believed her. "Be careful." She hurriedly grabbed her purse and left. Joe waited 5 minutes. Then he grabbed his jacket, got into his car, and followed her. She didn't go to Amber's. She parked near a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. Joe turned off the engine and watched as she got out, glanced around, then walked inside. His hands gripped the steering wheel. Deep breath. Exhale. He waited. 10 minutes. 15. 20. Then the hotel doors opened, and a man stepped out to meet Melissa. Tall. Short dark hair. Well-dressed. She smiled at him. He leaned in and kissed her. On the lips. Joe felt something turn over in his chest. His wife. His home. His family. And she had given it all away so easily to someone else. He watched as they got into the man's car and drove off. Joe followed them. They stopped at a luxurious restaurant. Joe parked nearby and watched as Melissa stepped out of the car, her lover placing a hand on her back, leading her inside. He could walk in right now, lay everything out on the table. But that would be too easy. He needed a plan. And he knew exactly how to make Melissa confess everything herself. Joe sat in his car, watching his wife laugh at a table in the restaurant. She placed her hand on the man's wrist, and he leaned in closer, whispering something in her ear. Joe thought he was ready to see this. He was wrong. His chest tightened with rage, but he didn't move. Not now. This wasn't his moment. He took out his phone and quickly snapped a picture of them. Then another. A video. He knew he would need this. But suddenly, something happened that he didn't expect. A black sedan pulled up in front of the restaurant. The door opened, and out stepped Amber, Melissa's best friend. Joe froze. Amber walked inside and headed straight for their table. He watched tensely as she said something, her hands clenched into fists. Melissa paled. Her lover shot a quick glance at Amber and grabbed his phone. Seconds later, Amber abruptly turned and ran out. Joe barely had time to process what was happening before she jumped into her car and sped away. His mouth went dry. What the hell just happened? He got home before Melissa. Sitting in the living room, he slowly turned a glass of whiskey in his hands. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the door finally opened. She tiptoed inside, thinking everyone was asleep. But when she saw him, she froze. "Why aren't you in bed?" Joe slowly lifted his gaze. "I could ask you the same thing." She pursed her lips. "I already told you. Business meeting." He scoffed. "Meeting? With that guy from the restaurant?" She flinched. "Joe, don't lie." She averted her eyes, turned toward the kitchen as if avoiding the conversation. But he didn't back down. "What's going on between you and Amber?" Melissa stopped abruptly. "What?" "I saw her today." She looked upset. Melissa pressed her lips together. "That's none of your business." "None of my business?" Joe raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? It's between us." "No, it's between all of us. I want to know the truth." She sighed and rubbed her temples. "Amber found out. She wasn't supposed to know." "Found out what?" "About me and..." Your lover? Melissa clenched her jaw, then suddenly looked at him sharply. You've been following me? Joe chuckled. Didn't have to. You weren't even trying to hide it. Silence fell between them. She took a step closer to him. I was going to tell you. Really? Yes. When? She didn't answer. Joe took a deep breath, clenching his jaw. Who did you cheat on me with? She remained silent. And then it hit him. He suddenly took a step back. Oh shit. Her eyes darted to the side. Joe. It's him, isn't it? Who? The one I'm thinking of. She clenched her fists. It's not that simple. Joe felt the blood rush to his face. Tell me it's not him. Melissa stayed silent. Joe let out a bitter laugh. Fucking hell. Melissa clenched her hands tighter. Joe, let me explain. Explain? He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. It was Trevor, wasn't it? Her silence told him everything. Trevor, his best friend. Joe stared at Melissa, and everything inside him burned. She was still silent. Her eyes darted around, lips pressed together as if she was trying to find the right words. He couldn't take it anymore. I said, how long? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. 6 months. Joe gripped the glass so tightly his fingers turned white. 6 months. 6 months of lying, smiling at him over dinner, kissing him goodbye before walking straight into the arms of his best friend. And you don't even feel guilty? Melissa's head snapped up. I do feel guilty, Joe. Oh, really? He let out a cold laugh. I don't see you suffering. You don't understand. She suddenly shouted. Then explain it to me. Explain why you slept with my best friend. Her eyes filled with tears, but Joe didn't believe them anymore. It just happened. It didn't just happen, Melissa. It was a choice. She lowered her head, and in that moment, Joe realized. She wasn't even trying to justify it. Do you love him? She didn't answer right away. I don't know. Perfect. Just perfect. He set the glass down on the table and slowly walked out of the kitchen. He needed to think. Joe couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the silence of a house where just days ago, he had thought he was a happy man. 6 months of lies. He picked up his phone and opened his chat with Trevor. Dozens of messages from the past months. How are things with Melissa? How are the kids? We should grab a drink sometime. It's been too long. Joe clenched his teeth. That bastard had been lying to his face. Joe pressed the call button. Dude, you still up? Trevor answered on the second ring, his voice relaxed, as if nothing had happened. Where are you right now? What? Where are you? Joe repeated. At home. Why are you asking? Joe closed his eyes for a second, suppressing his anger. We need to talk. Did something happen? Just tell me if you're home. Yeah. Good. Don't turn off your phone. Joe ended the call and quickly got dressed. Melissa stood in the bedroom doorway, her eyes red from crying. Where are you going? To talk to your friend. She rushed toward him, grabbing his arm. Joe, don't do this. He looked her straight in the eye. You're not my wife anymore, Melissa. Don't tell me what to do. He pulled his arm free and walked out of the room. Joe parked in front of Trevor's house and sat for a few moments, trying to steady his breathing. Then he got out, slamming the car door shut. He rang the doorbell. 1 second. 2. The door opened, and there stood Trevor, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, like he had just gotten off the couch. Joe? What's going on? Joe didn't answer. He just stared at him. Dude, you're freaking me out. Am I? Yeah. And you betrayed me. Trevor's expression changed. Dude, what are you? You know exactly what I'm talking about. A long silence followed. Joe saw something shift in Trevor's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was confidence. So, you know. Joe's fists clenched involuntarily. That's all you have to say? Trevor sighed, rubbing his face. I didn't want it to happen like this, but it did. Yeah. Joe looked at him and realized the man standing in front of him wasn't a friend. He was a traitor. Why? It wasn't planned. It just happened. Joe took a deep breath. She said she doesn't know if she loves you. Trevor hesitated for a second. What? She said she doesn't know. She said that? Yeah. Trevor looked away. Well, and you? Trevor met his gaze directly. Yeah, I love her. Joe felt something snap in his head. He punched Trevor in the face. Trevor didn't react in time, stumbling back, grabbing his jaw. Are you out of your damn mind? No, I'm just done being the nice guy. Trevor straightened up, looking at him defiantly. So what are you gonna do? Joe smirked. Just wait. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Trevor standing in the doorway, confused and irritated. Joe didn't need any more explanations. Now it was his turn to play by his own rules. Joe drove through the empty streets, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing. Trevor's words, "I love her," still rang in his ears. But what got to him even more was that she hadn't said it back. That meant, to her, Trevor was just an option, a backup. But if she still hadn't left Joe, it meant she wasn't sure. That gave him an advantage. He wasn't just going to accept this. He needed a plan. Not some petty revenge, something bigger. Something that would make them regret everything. He wouldn't lash out recklessly, wouldn't make a scene. He would make them both realize what they had destroyed, when it was already too late. When he got home, Melissa was still awake. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the news, but her face was empty, her eyes glassy. She didn't even ask where he had been. She just silently watched him walk past her and go upstairs. Her indifference hurt more than yelling or excuses, but he would make her notice him again. The next morning, he started acting. He wasn't the usual Joe, the one who woke up, made coffee, and went to work. He pretended everything was fine, but he began changing his habits. He stopped being predictable. He left the house earlier, came home later. He started dressing better, taking better care of himself, even signed up for a gym. He knew Melissa would notice, and she did. At first, she just watched. But soon, the look on her face changed. She started realizing she was no longer in control. She didn't know where he was, who he was with, or what he was doing. She was used to Joe always being around, always predictable, never changing. But now, he was a mystery. A few days later, she started getting curious. She tried to casually ask where he had been, but he only shrugged and gave vague answers. She asked when he'd be home, but he no longer gave her specific times. He saw how much it irritated her. But the real blow to her ego came when he skipped dinner for the first time in a long time. She had set the table, the kids were already eating, but he wasn't there. She waited, even texted him, but he didn't reply immediately. He responded an hour later with a short message, got held up. Nothing more. No explanations. Melissa started losing patience. Her balance was slipping. She tried to act like she didn't care, but he could see that she did. His next move was taking control of the finances. They had always shared a joint account, but now, Joe slowly started moving money into a separate one. He didn't do it all at once. He was careful. But little by little, he reduced her access to their shared funds. She didn't notice at first, but he knew the moment would come, and it did. One day, Melissa tried to make a big purchase for her blog, but the transaction was declined. She opened her banking app and saw that the joint account balance had dropped significantly. She brought it up at dinner that night. Joe calmly told her he was just being more mindful of their spending. He said it so confidently that she didn't even know how to argue. The next morning, Joe made another move. He left his phone on the table and walked out of the room, leaving the screen unlocked. A message notification popped up from an unknown number. Had a great time. Let's do it again? Melissa saw it. He knew she would. She didn't say anything right away, but her behavior changed. She started watching him more closely. She paid attention to when he left, when he came home, how he dressed. The next day, she couldn't take it anymore. She asked, "Who is she?" Joe smiled and gave a vague response. "Oh, just a friend," and walked away. The following days were tense. She became restless. She stayed home more, went out less, checked her phone constantly. But most importantly, she started getting angry. For the first time in a long time, she was no longer in control, and it was eating her alive. The moment of reckoning came when she finally snapped and asked, "Do you have someone else?" Joe looked at her and saw the fear in her eyes. The fear that he would say yes. She wanted to control the situation. But now, she was the one doubting, unsure of what was happening. He paused, felt the cold satisfaction fill him. What if I do? That was the moment her confidence shattered. He saw her lips pressed together. Her gaze drop. She hadn't expected him to change. Hadn't expected him to stop being the Joe she knew. Now, she was in the same trap she had created. And this was only the beginning. He sat in his car, staring at the city lights, but his eyes were empty. His hands clenched around the steering wheel. His heartbeat uneven, like it was trying to break free from his chest. Only a few words echoed in his head. Trevor said he loves me. I don't know if I love him. Melissa, his wife. The one person who wasn't supposed to betray him. She couldn't even say it. She couldn't admit that she was anything more than indifferent. Indifferent to him, to everything they had built together. And yet, he couldn't say it was a surprise. Joe had always felt a distance between them, one she had carefully hidden under the perfect image of her life. She was a blogger, successful, and to him, it was always more than just a job. It was her tool to control not only her reality but everyone around her. Trevor, the man he had called a friend, the man who had destroyed everything. Not only had he crossed an unforgivable line, but he had played a game Joe had never planned on joining. But Joe wasn't the kind of man to leave things to chance. Melissa probably didn't realize that everything had changed. She noticed he was different, but she didn't understand that her own actions had set something much bigger in motion. Joe was no longer the same man. He wasn't the man who ignored his instincts for the sake of stability. He had lost faith in it. And this was just the beginning. When he came home, he noticed her. She was sitting in the dark living room, staring at the blank TV screen. She didn't ask where he had been. Her indifference, it was a blow. She didn't care. She wanted him to be predictable. But now, with no control over him, her nerves were starting to crack. Her internal grip was slipping. Joe didn't confront her immediately. He silently went upstairs and began shifting his strategy. He started moving relentlessly. No longer the man who was always there, ready to bend at a moment's notice. He became unpredictable. He stopped giving answers. Instead, he left only hints. Melissa grew more and more confused. She didn't understand where he was, why he had changed, why she no longer had control. And none of it was an accident. She asked where he was going, who he was with. He only shrugged. And every time, she felt her grip slipping. She was trapped in the very cage she had built herself. And it terrified her. She started growing nervous. But Joe's biggest move came when he skipped dinner for the first time. She lost her grip on the situation, and for the first time, she felt powerless. He was always there, always at the table, ready for dinner. But now, he was gone. That threw her off balance. She waited, but he never showed. It was unbelievable to her. Her next move was obvious. She decided to figure out what had happened to his money. They had always shared a joint budget, but Joe had been shifting financial flows. At first, it was almost unnoticeable, but eventually, she realized he was being far more careful with spending. The joint account had started shrinking. And then it hit her. This wasn't just a change in habits. It was a strategy he had been executing long before she even realized it. The turning point came when she tried to make a purchase for her blog, but the transaction was declined. She checked the bank app and saw that the joint account had dropped significantly. Joe simply told her that he was being more mindful of expenses. He looked completely calm, and that shocked her. How had he done it? How had he changed everything so that she was no longer in his plans? That was when she realized that things were no longer going her way. Joe wasn't just a mystery. He had started reclaiming something that had long been lost. His power wasn't in money or manipulation. His power was in becoming unpredictable to her. He made her feel uncertain. And that was her worst nightmare, the unknown. And then, she saw it. She saw the message on his phone. A message from a woman. Just a simple message he had forgotten to lock his screen for. He knew she would see it. Her reaction was predictable. She didn't ask him right away. She just stared at it, feeling her control slowly but steadily slipping away. And each passing day only made her more obsessed. She could no longer sit in the shadows. Her nerves snapped. She couldn't let it go. And this time, she didn't just ask about the woman. She asked if he had someone else. And though her eyes burned with intensity, though she tried to keep herself composed, she knew she was no longer in control. Joe felt it. He saw how restless she was. how her confidence in her plans was crumbling like sand slipping through her fingers. Now, he was the one setting the terms. He was the one she couldn't figure out. In this moment, it was just the beginning. Her voice was low, but every word carried a nervous edge. She tried to maintain control, but his calmness unbalanced her. It was hard for her to accept that the man who had once been her foundation was now someone else entirely. The Joe she knew was gone. He no longer reacted to her manipulations, no longer made her feel safe. For weeks, he had kept his distance, letting her spiral, trying to make sense of his cold behavior. But the moment she finally admitted she didn't understand what was happening, he played his final card. And the moment she decided to take action, she realized things weren't going the way she had planned. Trevor had been just a piece of her betrayal, maybe not even the most shocking part. Joe had spent weeks tracking her every move, concealing his true intentions. She had watched him become more financially aware, noticed his habits shifting, but she had never realized he was also changing psychologically. Everything that once felt safe and under her control had suddenly become a question. Trevor had indeed crossed the final line, but he had also become her weakness. Instead of fighting for what was left of their relationship, Melissa had tried to end things quickly and quietly. But Joe wasn't the man she expected. The moment she finally uncovered what he had been doing, Joe was sitting in his favorite spot, a large armchair in the corner, the one she had always thought was too big for his frame. This time, she didn't see the insecure man who had once tried to hold onto their marriage at all costs. His expression was calm, steady, but there was no longer any trace of the guilt that had once weighed him down. He had become cold, and he wasn't ready to compromise. When she came home, only one simple question left her lips. Joe didn't answer right away. He just smiled, and that unnerved her even more. She could feel the overwhelming confidence she had always carried slipping away. And that was the biggest blow. She tried to explain her betrayal, but she knew her words no longer mattered. Joe looked at her now like a stranger, like someone he no longer recognized. And in that moment, it became clear. He had known everything all along. He had known about Trevor. He had known about all her secrets. And more than that, he was now ready to claim his victory. He had turned her into the one drowning in her own lies. What she should have seen earlier was now painfully obvious. Her instincts had failed her. She had focused on the details but missed the one that truly mattered. Joe had taken control of everything, even her thoughts. And now, as she sat there feeling utterly powerless, Joe delivered the final blow to her strategy. What happened next was the inevitable end of their relationship. Melissa was left alone, with no sympathy, with no protection that she once thought was unbreakable. But Joe wasn't satisfied with just leaving her in the abyss. This was more than revenge. His plan ran deeper than it had seemed at first glance. Everything he had done was part of something bigger. She had never suspected it, but he had been preparing for this moment for a long time, planning every detail down to perfection. Trevor wasn't the only one Joe had used to ensure there was no way back for Melissa. He had orchestrated everything not just to break her, but to make sure she had no way to rebuild. He wasn't just prepared to watch her fall. He had designed a trap she could never escape, a downfall so thorough it stripped her of more than just control over their relationship. It took away her identity. By the time she realized everything was slipping out of her hands, it was already too late. Joe made his final move, the move that cornered her completely. And now, she was just a shadow of the woman she once was. She sat there, staring into nothingness. Her hands trembled. This was the moment when Joe had outplayed her completely. Now, she had nothing. All her attempts to build a new life, to find comfort in her betrayal, meant nothing. And in that moment, Joe got exactly what he wanted. He hadn't just gotten revenge. He had taken her control, stripped her of her power, left her lost and alone. And now, Joe was finally free. If you found out that your wife or partner had been with someone else, would you be able to leave her if that was the only way to preserve your dignity?